I thought I was coming home to a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where you unpack a suitcase, throw a load of laundry into the washer, and maybe sit on the back porch with a cold drink while pretending you aren't already thinking about Monday morning. Instead, I pulled into my driveway and found what looked like a luxury resort growing out of my backyard. At first, I honestly thought I had taken a wrong turn into somebody else's neighborhood. There was sunlight bouncing off bright blue water, music playing somewhere behind my fence line, and people laughing like they were attending a private pool party. The problem was, I didn't own a pool. My name is Ethan Carter, and for nearly 12 years I had lived on that property without a single issue worth mentioning. The house wasn't fancy, but it sat on a large lot outside a growing suburban development. And my favorite part of the property was the back corner near an old red oak tree my father planted before he passed away. That section wasn't visible from the street, which made it perfect for reading, grilling, or just sitting alone when life got noisy. So when I walked through my side gate and saw a massive infinity edge pool occupying a huge section of that exact corner, I froze. Not because I was confused anymore, but because my brain couldn't immediately process the level of confidence required for another human being to build something that expensive on land they didn't own. Standing beside the pool was my neighbor, a guy named Brandon Hale. Brandon was one of those people who treated life like a competition nobody else knew they were participating in. Every year, he remodeled something. New driveway, bigger deck, outdoor kitchen, imported landscaping, luxury lighting. If there was a way to spend money so people would notice, Brandon had already done it. The strange thing was that he wasn't a bad neighbor at first. Arrogant, sure. Loud, definitely. But not openly hostile. That changed the moment he noticed me staring at the pool. He raised a glass, smiled, and walked over like he was about to give me a tour. "Pretty incredible, right?" he said. I looked at him, then at the pool, then back at him. "Why is there a pool on my property?" I asked. He actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. The kind of laugh people make when they think you're being unreasonable. "Come on, Ethan," he said. "It's basically a shared improvement." Nobody was using that section anyway. Shared improvement. I remember those exact words because they sounded so ridiculous that my brain kept repeating them long after the conversation ended. I walked toward the fence line and started checking landmarks I had known for years. The oak tree, the retaining stones, the survey marker near the back corner. My stomach dropped. Brandon wasn't a few feet over the line. He wasn't even close. A substantial portion of the entire pool structure was sitting on my land. "You need to tell me this is temporary." I said, "You need to tell me somebody made a mistake." Brandon crossed his arms and shrugged. The contractor handled everything. That answer told me more than he realized. People who accidentally cross a property line don't act relaxed. People who know exactly what they did act relaxed. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through records, old surveys, and county maps. Every document showed the same thing. The land belonged to me. There was no ambiguity, no estrangerismo, no hidden agreement. Just my property and Brandon's property separated by a boundary he had apparently decided was optional. The next morning I contacted the city. I expected immediate concern. Instead, I got transferred between departments like a hot potato nobody wanted to hold. One office said permits had been approved. Another said property disputes were civil matters. A third person told me someone likely misunderstood the plans. Meanwhile, the pool remained exactly where it was, filled with water, surrounded by lounge chairs, and occupied by people who had no idea they were sunbathing on land owned by somebody else. For the next week, I watched Brandon host gathering after gathering. Every evening, there were new guests, new drinks, new music, new social media photos. He acted like he had upgraded the entire neighborhood and expected applause for it. The worst part wasn't even the construction. It was the attitude. Every time I saw him, he wore that same self-satisfied expression, like he had already won an argument nobody else was allowed to finish. Eventually, my anger started turning into something else. Curiosity, because the more I looked at the project, the more I noticed something unusual. Behind the decorative stone wall near the rear edge of the pool was a narrow strip of untouched land. Nobody had landscaped it. Nobody had poured concrete there. Nobody had installed lighting. It was still exactly as it had been before construction started. And according to every survey I owned, it belonged entirely to me. One evening, I stood there watching water drain through the slope after a light rainstorm. And that was when I noticed it. The natural flow pattern, the low spot, the way moisture collected in that narrow strip. Brandon never paid attention to it because he was too busy looking at the pool. But standing there alone, I suddenly realized something he didn't. That little forgotten section of land might end up becoming the most important piece of property in the entire neighborhood. And the moment that idea entered my head, I stopped arguing with Brandon completely. Now, before I tell you what I did next, let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners make a mistake. When somebody crosses a property line, your first instinct is usually to go nuclear, call lawyers, threaten lawsuits, start screaming across fences. The problem is that emotional reactions often help the person who caused the problem. According to standard procedure, property disputes move slowly because agencies need surveys, permits, inspections, and documentation before taking action. From a legal perspective, ownership rights don't disappear just because someone builds something expensive on your land. In fact, the more money they invest before verifying boundaries, the bigger their problem can become later. And honestly, this is a psychological trap many arrogant people fall into. They start believing that confidence is the same thing as authority. Once enough people accept their version of reality, they assume the facts no longer matter. Brandon wasn't just building a pool. He was building a narrative where nobody would challenge him because the project looked too big to undo. The lesson here is that patience can sometimes become the most powerful tool in a conflict, especially when the other person is busy creating evidence against themselves. Now, before I tell you what I did next, let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners make a mistake. When somebody crosses a property line, your first instinct is usually to go nuclear, call lawyers, threaten lawsuits, start screaming across fences. The problem is that emotional reactions often help the person who caused the problem. According to standard procedure, property disputes move slowly because agencies need surveys, permits, inspections, and documentation before taking action. From a legal perspective, ownership rights don't disappear just because someone builds something expensive on your land. In fact, the more money they invest before verifying boundaries, the bigger their problem can become later. And honestly, this is a psychological trap many arrogant people fall into. They start believing that confidence is the same thing as authority. Once enough people accept their version of reality, they assume the facts no longer matter. Brandon wasn't just building a pool. He was building a narrative where nobody would challenge him because the project looked too big to undo. The lesson here is that patience can sometimes become the most powerful tool in a conflict, especially when the other person is busy creating evidence against themselves. The funny thing about patience is that from the outside, it looks exactly like surrender. For the next couple of weeks, that's what Brandon thought he was seeing. He thought I'd accepted the situation. He thought I'd realized fighting him was pointless. He thought the pool was permanent and that eventually I'd get tired of making phone calls that went nowhere. So while he was busy celebrating his victory, I was busy working on something else entirely. Every evening after work, I carried tools into that narrow strip of untouched land behind the pool. Nothing dramatic. No heavy machinery. No construcción cruz. Just a shovel, a wheelbarrow, some native plants, and a plan. The area already collected water naturally after rainstorms. And with a little effort, I was able to deepen it enough to hold water consistently. Then I started researching local wetland vegetation, natural filtration systems, and small wildlife habitats. If Brandon wanted a luxury resort, I was about to build nature's version of one. The first few days, nobody paid attention. Why would they? Compared to his massive infinity pool, my little project looked insignificant. Brandon continued throwing parties almost every weekend. Music echoed across the neighborhood. Guests wandered around taking pictures. Expensive outdoor lights reflected across the water every night. He was living inside his own promotional video. Meanwhile, I kept digging. I added rocks along the edges. I planted native grasses. I installed a simple shaded nesting area beneath a cluster of shrubs. Then I placed a small wooden sign near the edge of the water. Wildlife Restoration Area. That sign would eventually become one of the most irritating things Brandon had ever seen. The first ducks arrived on a Tuesday morning. 2 of them. I was drinking coffee on my porch when they landed in the shallow water like they had received a personal invitation. I remember laughing because it felt absurd. After everything that had happened, the first guests to appreciate my project were ducks. A few days later there were 5, then 8, then an entire family. Apparently the pond offered exactly what local wildlife wanted: fresh water, food sources, shade, and peace. Brandon still didn't care. At least not initially. Then one Saturday afternoon, he walked over while I was trimming plants near the shoreline. He looked annoyed before he even opened his mouth. "What's that smell?" he asked. I looked around dramatically. Fresh water. That's soil. Plants. Nature, I guess. His expression tightened immediately. "Well, it's drifting toward the pool." "Funny," I replied. The pool drifted toward my property. He didn't appreciate that answer. Over the next month, things became increasingly entertaining. The ducks absolutely loved the area. They nested there. They fed there. They raised ducklings there. And because the pond sat so close to the pool's edge, they occasionally explored neighboring territory. Guests would arrive expecting a luxury backyard experience and instead find ducks waddling casually through the landscape like tiny feathered property inspectors. One memorable afternoon, I watched a family pose for photos beside Brandon's waterfall feature. Halfway through the pictures, 6 ducks marched through the frame in perfect formation. The photographer laughed. Brandon did not. Then came the feathers. Not a huge number, but enough to irritate someone obsessed with appearances. Every morning his pool cleaning system collected little reminders that nature doesn't care about luxury branding. Soon he started trying solutions. First came ultrasonic deterrent devices. The ducks ignored them. Then came reflective decorations designed to scare birds away. The ducks ignored those too. Then he hired a wildlife specialist. That lasted about a week. The specialist walked around, examined the pond, looked at the vegetation, and basically explained that wildlife tends to enjoy places specifically designed for wildlife. Brandon was furious. One afternoon, I overheard him arguing with the specialist near the fence. "I paid you to get rid of them." The specialist shrugged. "They're not causing harm. They're ruining the atmosphere. That's not really a wildlife issue." I nearly spilled my coffee laughing. What made the situation even better was how guests started reacting differently. Kids love the ducks. Families love the ducks. Several neighbors started bringing binoculars to watch them. Meanwhile, Brandon's vision of an exclusive luxury retreat slowly fell apart because nature refused to follow the script. The more he tried controlling the environment, the more obvious it became that he couldn't. That's when he made a mistake. Frustrated and desperate, he began complaining to city officials about my pond. He filed reports, requested inspections, claimed environmental concerns, claimed nuisance concerns, claimed safety concerns. Basically, he threw every complaint he could think of at the wall and hoped something would stick. What he didn't realize was that every complaint invited more attention to the area. More attention meant more inspections. More inspections meant more measurements. More measurements meant more people looking closely at the original pool project. One morning, nearly 3 months after I first came home and discovered the pool, a city inspector arrived. Then another. Then a survey team. Unlike the earlier conversations, these people weren't relying on assumptions. They were carrying equipment. They were taking measurements. They were comparing physical markers against official records. Brandon remained confident at first. I could see it in the way he walked around the property. He still believed the size of the project would protect him. After all, nobody wants to admit a massive construction mistake after it's already finished. But facts are stubborn things. By late afternoon, the mood had changed. The surveyors were talking quietly among themselves. The inspectors kept reviewing paperwork. Brandon stopped smiling. 2 days later, the official findings arrived. The pool wasn't merely crossing the property line. It extended significantly farther than originally reported. Multiple sections of the structure occupied land he did not own. Additional setback requirements had not been properly satisfied. Several approvals had been based on inaccurate assumptions regarding boundary locations. In simple terms, the deeper investigators looked, the worse the situation became. I still remember the morning Brandon knocked on my door. Gone was the confident grin. Gone was the superior attitude. He looked exhausted. "Maybe we can work something out," he said. I almost laughed. For months, I had tried discussing the issue reasonably. Now that consequences were arriving, suddenly he wanted cooperation. "Work what out?" I asked. "The property situation. You mean the one I told you about the day I got home?" He stared at the ground for several seconds. "Look, mistakes were made." That sentence would have carried more weight if he hadn't spent months insisting there was no mistake. The city eventually issued formal corrective orders. Large portions of the encroaching structure had to be modified. Some sections required removal. Expensive redesign work followed. Contractors returned. Concrete was cut. Features were relocated. What had once been the centerpiece of Brandon's backyard became a constant reminder that shortcuts have price tags. Meanwhile, inspectors reviewed my pond and found that everything complied with applicable regulations. The habitat used native vegetation. It improved drainage. It created environmental benefits. Most importantly, it existed entirely on my property. Over time, the area gained recognition as a small but legitimate wildlife habitat. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just a quiet, natural space doing exactly what it was designed to do. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Brandon spent a fortune forcing something into a place it didn't belong. I spent a fraction of that amount working with what was already there. One project fought reality. The other cooperated with it. In the end, only one of them required demolition crews. These days, the whole situation feels almost surreal when I think back on it. Every morning, I step onto my porch with a cup of coffee, look across the pond, and watch ducks glide through the water without the slightest concern for property disputes, permits, inspections, or expensive mistakes. The oak tree still stands where it always stood. The pond has matured. The plants have filled in. What started as a narrow strip of forgotten land has become the most peaceful part of my property. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, Brandon's backyard looks very different from the luxury masterpiece he originally imagined. The pool still exists, but it had to be redesigned, reduced, and partially reconstructed. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of something people often forget. Just because you can build something doesn't mean you should. Looking back, I realized the pool was never really the heart of the conflict. The pool was just the symptom. The real issue was entitlement. Brandon convinced himself that his vision mattered more than boundaries. He assumed that because he had money, contractors, permits, and momentum, reality would eventually adjust itself around his plans. That's a dangerous mindset. Honestly, it shows up everywhere, not just in neighborhoods. This is a psychological trap many people fall into. They start believing that confidence creates legitimacy. They mistake certainty for authority. The longer nobody challenges them, the more convinced they become that they are right. Then eventually they run into facts, and facts don't negotiate. According to standard procedure, property rights exist for a reason. Boundaries aren't suggestions. Surveys aren't decorations. Inspections aren't inconveniences. They're safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. From a legal perspective, one of the most expensive mistakes a property owner can make is assuming first and verifying later. I've talked to enough homeowners since this happened to know that similar disputes occur more often than people realize. Fences get misplaced. Driveways cross boundaries. Sheds end up on neighboring lots. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's negligence. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's pure arrogance. The lesson here is that patience often looks weak right before it becomes powerful. There were plenty of moments when I wanted to explode. There were days when I wanted to hire lawyers immediately, start shouting matches, or make every interaction a battle. Had I done that, I probably would have spent months trapped in endless arguments. Instead, I focused on documentation, observation, and strategy. That doesn't mean people should never fight back. It means they should choose how they fight back. Emotion feels satisfying in the moment, but evidence tends to win in the long run. Another lesson is that nature has a funny way of humbling people. Brandon invested an incredible amount of money trying to create the perfect environment, something controlled, polished, exclusive, and impressive. Then a handful of ducks arrived and completely changed the story. Not because they were aggressive, not because they were destructive, simply because reality doesn't always cooperate with our plans. There's something strangely poetic about that. The thing Brandon viewed as insignificant ended up becoming the thing he couldn't control. And if I'm being honest, I think that's why this entire story resonates with so many people. Most of us have encountered someone who believes rules apply differently to them. Most of us have dealt with a person who mistakes confidence for competence. Watching those situations eventually correct themselves feels satisfying because it restores a sense of balance. In the end, I didn't win because I was smarter. I didn't win because I was richer. I didn't even win because I had a better argument. I won because the facts never changed. The property line was where it had always been. The records said what they had always said. The truth remained the truth, even when someone tried to build over it. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered your neighbor had built part of a luxury project on your property, what would you have done? Would you have called a lawyer immediately? Would you have demanded demolition on day one? Or would you have taken a different approach entirely? Let me know in the comments, because these situations always spark strong opinions, and honestly, some of the best discussions happen when reasonable people disagree. And remember, sometimes the biggest victories don't come from shouting the loudest. Sometimes they come from staying patient, knowing your rights, and letting reality catch up with the people who thought it never would.